We're not going to do that today. Today we're going to talk about a specific paper. The paper's not called A Whale of a Tale, but that's what I titled my presentation because it felt good. It felt right. But on Monday we're going to play a similar game, except for all we're going to do is focus on times in which Scripture presents something very contradictory to what the dominant interpretation of the data are, and how do we deal with that? What do we do in those situations? So that's a bit of a foreshadowing for Monday. But today we need to talk about this Esperanza, Brand, Chadwick, and there's one other co-author on this paper. It is, I think, the 6th paper published on this whale graveyard in Peru, the Pisco Formation. And so we're going to work through it basically piece by piece. We'll go through and I'll give you basically what are the key background pieces of information that you need to know in order to understand this paper. Okay? And then we'll go through and we'll say, okay, let's just focus in what were the most important aspects of what they did, because they did a lot. It's a long paper. If you read all of the appendices, it was like 46 pages. If you didn't read all of the appendices, it was not 46 pages, it was 21, and like half of those pages are full page images. But it was meaty. They did a lot, and so we need to focus in what were the key aspects of what they did, what were the key things that they found, and how did their particular philosophical commitments actually shape their interpretation of those data. All right? Okay, so I will give somebody an opportunity to do this for us, and if nobody takes that opportunity, then we're going to pick people at random, and hopefully you read enough of the paper to feel comfortable to do some of these things. All right, so as we think about like the background, just general information about geology, general information about taphonomy, general information about the fossil record, what would you say are the key fundamental understandings in order to read this paper? Would you say are like the key just pieces like this? These are the key things that the writers assume you know as their reader, because they don't really teach that. Yeah. What's up? It's so funny. You looked like you were hiding from having to be asked to give it, and then you volunteer. Yeah. Bless you.
Goodness, that like most people assume. I feel like most people assume it's like the uniformitarianism view.
Okay.
So that's like good to know. And what layers of rock different things are found at.
Right. So they don't teach a whole lot about the geological column. They just start using names of epochs and not really giving you a lot of information. That is something that they assume you understand, and they assume that you know. And because I don't make that same assumption, I will teach it to you. You're welcome for that. Any other key things that you would say would have really helped you understand this paper had you known? And we're not focusing on what did they actually do at this point, or what did they actually find, what were the key aspects of the find, just some things that would have been helpful for them to maybe write in their background. Yeah.
I would say maybe just a better understanding of like the rate of deposition or preservation.
Yeah.
Or I don't think I have a really good understanding of it, so maybe when they use...
Well, they actually didn't talk about rate of sedimentation until the very end of their paper when they were doing their discussion, basically the summary. Here's how our interpretation of these data were influenced, and then they finally talk about the proposed rates of deposition for this area. And you don't see anything in the introduction, and it would be a great piece of information to have. I didn't actually put that up here, but it would be a great piece of information to have. Charles, you look like you want to say something.
It seems like, well, first of all, it was a pretty foundational, or not foundational, but it gave you a lot of foundational information in the paper.
It did. It gave you a lot of information about the specific site.
Yeah.
So it gave you an enormous amount of information about that formation,
Right.
and about what you typically find, what other researchers have found.
But they assumed a lot of, that you were familiar with a lot of the biological things like taxonomy, etc. They also assumed you knew the relevance of diatoms and things like that.
Yes.
And then some sedimentary knowledge of the reader.
Yeah.
They assumed.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about some of the biological information that I think is key to understanding what they did that they just assume that you have, which is interesting because this is very much a paleontology paper, which tends to be heavily influenced by geology, and then so usually you get a lot more like foundational biological understanding. But
didn't they present this at GSA?
Probably they present something along these lines almost every year at GSA.
About the whales?
Yes.
Every year.
Yeah, Esperanza does. Brand researches all sorts of different things. He's a maverick. But anyways, he started his career as an animal behavioral ecologist, and then now he does all sorts of different stuff. But all right, so what do you need to know? What are I think the main pieces of background information that would be really helpful for understanding this? All right, so here we're going to focus just in on the Phanerozoic, and which would be everything Cambrian and afterwards, everything from the Cambrian explosion to present time. Okay, and then so we can break these up into 3 different eras: Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic. Mesozoic is probably the one that most people are most familiar with because this is known as the time of the reptiles or the time of the dinosaurs, where your charismatic megafauna, which again is a term, I don't know if I've actually used that term in this class. Anyways, charismatic megafauna is just a fancy way of saying you're really big and beautiful and interesting animals. But they all tend to be dinosaurs in these deposits, right? And everybody loves dinosaurs, which is why Dr. McLean teaches a biology of dinosaurs class. There's not a single biology major in it, and there are like 35 students in it.
I'm in it.
Are you this year?
I'm the only biologist.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And it's not 35, but what do you have, like 19, 20? 25.
We grew.
I mean, it's just crazy.
Yeah.
It's just crazy, but everybody loves dinosaurs, right? They're very charismatic and interesting. Paleozoic, sometimes referred to as the age of the fishes. Certainly the first half and even getting towards the end are primarily marine deposits. And so you have a lot of marine organisms. It's where you first start to find plants. It's where you first start to find land-dwelling animals. And just really interesting, but not as well known. And then Cenozoic includes everything from the mass extinction at the end of the Mesozoic, where all of your really charismatic dinosaur forms disappear, all the way up to present time. Okay, the Cenozoic is strange in that in that there's really not any way. Sometimes it's referred to as the age of the mammals, but of all of the names, that one makes the least amount of sense. We call it the age of the mammals because that's when we show up in the fossil record. That's when our charismatic mammals show up in the fossil record. But mammals don't in any way make up a significant percentage of the fossils you find at Cenozoic deposits. They're just as, they should all be referred to as age of the fishes. Most of our fossils are fish in any of them. But it also tends to be the only one where we focus on epochs instead of in focusing on periods. So when we refer to Mesozoic deposits, we usually call them Triassic, Jurassic, or Cretaceous deposits. In the Cenozoic, we rarely use the names of the periods. We almost always use the name of the epochs. Yeah, Jordan.
This is just a question for how it's
Yeah.
structured, but why is it broken into so many categories? Eon, era, period. Is that just because it's such a large amount?
Yes, it's a huge. It's just a huge amount of rock. And so what you'd be looking at in terms of a very uniformitarian perspective, you're looking at 550 million years of rock, even up to like 600 million years, maybe 650, depending on when you date the beginning of the Cambrian. Yeah, so you're talking about a huge amount of material there. Yeah.
Why do we focus on epochs for this? Is it because of
That's a good question. Because
differently.
yeah, it just it changes so much. There's so much radical transformation within the Cenozoic that it really forces us to focus on smaller deposits, less rock, and less amount of time. So, and again, a very uniformitarian idea of geology. This is about 65 million years or so in the entire Cenozoic era, and then split into 7 epochs. Yeah,
What
Alyssa.
is the KANA?
Oh yeah, so this is 1,000 years ago. 11.8 thousand years ago, and then these are million years ago. Sometimes you'll see MYA instead of MA, or KYA. GA
Yeah.
is billion years ago. Why do they use G? It's because it's giga. Times 10 to the 9th power. YA? I don't know.
Years ago?
Years ago. A for the Latin for annum or annus or whatever the Latin word for year is. Yeah. So these are billion years ago, these are million years ago, these are 1,000 years ago. Alright? So these deposits for this paper are all right here. They're all at the end of the Miocene, beginning of the Pliocene. That's where all these deposits are. Okay, and we'll deal with a little bit of dates in as we're talking about what were their main data, what did they find. But this is basically what we're talking about. Yeah, Alyssa.
So from a Christian perspective, this would be after the flood.
By most flood models, yes. Yeah, so most flood models hold that the flood ended right here. Right at the break between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene, or Cretaceous and Paleocene epoch. That this is the end of flood deposits. Some flood models take the flood deposits higher up, but almost all flood models end it at here at the latest. But many of them, if not most, end it right here. Yeah, so these would be post-flood deposits by almost every model of a global cataclysmic flood. Yeah, it's a good question. All right? Other bits of massive information that you need. So here is a mass stranding of toothed whales. This paper was entirely focused on baleen whales. I understand that, and I know that these are toothed whales. But there's a little bit you have to understand about whale biology in order to really get a good sense of what they actually did, why they did it, and why they interpreted their data in a particular way. So whales, there's a typical correlation between the size of a mammal and how long it lives. There's a very strong, linear, positive correlation. The bigger a mammal is, the longer it lives. Whales are enormous, would you agree? Even toothed whales, these are pretty big animals. They're about the length of the height of a really tall human, outweigh an average human by quite a bit. These are long-lived animals. And so, and what you find is, which I guess this should make sense, they tend to not live in really dense groupings. Okay? You have some exceptions to that in your toothed whales, right? You'll have dolphins, which are a type of toothed whales, will sometimes have huge pods. Killer whales or porpoises or orcas, whatever you want to call them, they can have some pretty large hunting pods. But for the most part, whales tend to not live in really, really dense groupings. Okay? So it is very unusual to find to have mass stranding events. Okay? Very unusual. It's not unusual to have stranding events where you either have a live whale or a dead whale wash up on shore and end up getting stuck. But it is unusual to have a mass stranding event. This picture was taken in 2011, where you not only had this mass stranding event, but you actually had several dozen mass stranding events in a fairly short amount of time of a lot of different toothed whale species. And so, another thing you need to understand, this probably makes sense to you, but bodies of organisms do not last a long time in water. Okay? Especially soft tissues. Soft tissues deteriorate very, very quickly in water. And it's because it's very easy to colonize those carcasses. And you're like, well, on land, you've got flies show up very early, and that's true. But they don't tend to show up in quite the number that you get in aquatic environments. So soft tissues tend to disappear very quickly in dead carcasses underwater. Okay, so it's very unusual to find mass stranding events where you have a large number of whales dying all at the same time. And it's very unusual to find their carcasses in really good shape. Okay? Another thing you need to know is when a whale dies, like other organisms, when they die, your gut bacteria continue to feed. Okay? Your gut bacteria continue to feed on whatever's there, which when there's no food there, they'll start to feed on other gut bacteria or on the lining of your gut. They just continue to feed. right? They don't really care all that much that you've died. I mean, your body temperature will cool, so some of their processes won't work as quickly, but they'll continue to feed. And as they do, they'll build gases up inside of your digestive system, okay? And so when a whale dies, it tends to float for a while because their bodies are really packed full of a lot of gases, and they tend to turn over. And they mention this a little bit in the paper, but it's you almost never find a whale carcass at the bottom of the water ventral side down. It's almost always upside down, ventral side up, okay? And it's because the gut is dominantly here, and that's the part that floats, yeah.
Wait, if it's floating, then how does it get to the bottom of the ocean?
Releasing of those gases. So as it starts to, the soft tissue breaks down, it allows those gases to escape. Right? Sometimes, have you ever seen like a piece of roadkill? It starts to puff up, like after it's been there for a few days, and then you drive by it again and it's flattened. Have you ever noticed that? It's because it blew up. It burst. It burst open either because the gas is built up and it did that, and then at the same time, there are organisms decomposing the soft tissue and breaking, like making that barrier smaller and smaller, and it just like a balloon that the outside is shrinking. It blew up. And that's what'll happen with the whales as well, and then they'll sink down to the bottom. All right? It's fun, right? This is background knowledge. This is what you ought to know in order to be able to understand the significance of what they did and what they found. All right? Any other questions? Taphonomy, it's such a wonderful, wonderful area of study. I worked with a guy at Cedarville who did his PhD studying taphonomy of fish. And he did it while he taught at Cedarville, and he just had fish at different stages of decomposition all over the building. Stored in refrigerators, out in the open, behind the building, like at different environmental conditions, and everybody loved it.
Did you see
Everybody
one
loved
actually
it.
blow up?
No, this was probably even before I was born. Definitely before I was there. Yeah, when I joined the faculty at Cedarville, there was somebody on the faculty there that had been teaching there more than twice as long as I'd been alive. Yeah. They had been teaching there longer than both of my parents had been alive. It was awesome. Anyways, that's another story for another time. Okay? So what else do you need to know? Not a whole lot. I think that's you're in a pretty good position now when I tell you these were the main things that they did, and these are the main things that they found, that you should be at least in a position where you could interpret those data. Yeah, Alyssa.
What causes mass?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So this, we don't know for certain, but this one we're pretty sure it was due to the U.S. Navy testing different sound waves as a means to combat enemy subs. Jam enemy sub, like software and sonar, that they were testing basically sound jamming equipment in the area where all these whales died. And then the whales actually showed evidence that they had the bends, which whales typically don't get. That happens when you surface too quickly and you've got a bunch of nitrogen gas dissolved in your tissues, and then it escapes and it starts just blowing up vessels everywhere. Happens when you go scuba diving if you surface too quickly. Almost never happens in marine mammals because they have ways to combat against that. But it just looked like that they surfaced way too fast in response to something. And their eardrums were blown out, so.
Those are false killer whales, right?
Yes, I mean, that's one common name for them. I don't know what the scientific name is for these toothed whales. Yeah. All right, cool. So what do they do? Let's just, they did a lot, right? But we don't need to know everything that they did. Let's focus on the key things that they did, okay? These are the things, like, I don't know, say hypothetically there's a midterm at the end of week 9, and you have a question about what they did in this paper. This is what you would be held responsible for. So, first key aspect is they only used animals found at the surface. They actually didn't dig in this formation at all to unearth animals. They used only animals that they found at the surface. And that's an important reason why they mentioned erosion so much in this paper. I don't know if you noticed that or not, but erosion, that word appeared 43 times in this paper. I actually don't know if I didn't count them. That was just a number I threw out. But that's pretty close. I bet if you went through and you counted them, it's going to be pretty close. And it's because they only used carcasses at the surface. So they had been unearthed and due to weathering, had different states of deterioration. So using only animals found at the surface, they recorded the location of the specimen using GPS position, the elevation, as well as the position relative to marker beds. And so they had really, really precise locations of these animals. That'll be important when you start to think about big picture features of this formation.
No, I thought they reburied a lot of them, so it sounded like.
Well, they did afterwards. Yeah, they did afterwards.
But they had to excavate some of them.
Well, they had to, yes. So just because the animal's at the surface doesn't mean the entire specimen of that animal is at the surface, right? So for some of them, they found just a piece of the skull, and they unearthed enough of the body to see how much of the skeleton was there, and then they tried to restore it to what it was like when they found it. But they didn't go digging for any animals. I mean, except for the animals that they did dig because they had already saw some of the body. Yeah. Yeah.
Makes you wonder how much more are there.
Oh, a lot more. Thousands more. Yeah. All right. Some other things. They recorded the skull and the body orientation. And so what way was the animal facing? Was its body really contorted? Did it seem like it was in normal anatomical position? All of those pieces of information. This one's fun. This word didn't appear, but what I'm going to put next, but I took everything they did and summed it into 2 words. Skull morphometrics. This is a wonderful term here. And it's basically just a fancy way of saying that they recorded a number of different shapes and sizes within the skull. What was the width? What was the length? What was, the size of just this particular bone in the skull? Skull morphometrics. You're welcome for that one. That's a good word. It's maybe I don't even. Sorry, my brain's not working all that great today. I was gonna make a joke, but it didn't come to me. The degree of articulation. So how well were the bones still attached together or in the proper place, and then the completeness of the skeleton. Was it entirely complete? Was it pretty close to complete? Was it nowhere near complete? Were the bones articulated? Were they disarticulated but still clustered? Were they just, all over the place? Preservation of the bones, and this was done mainly macroscopically for this study, although they referenced other studies in which they had done some microscopic analysis of the bones. But in this one, they did mostly macroscopic preservation of the bone.
How many bones did they collect, even?
That's a good question. I mean, they collected, I think, 200 and something total specimens.
Mm-hmm.
And I really don't know how many bones each one of those specimens had. But probably in the thousands. So, I don't know, 250,000 bones. But a lot of them, I mean, they didn't actually remove them. They just unearthed them in order to do a macroscopic analysis of the bone and then reburied.
Well, you said they did a microscopic analysis.
Not for this study.
Right.
They referenced previous studies.
That they did on these bones.
That a grad student did
On these bones?
No, not, well, in the same deposit, but not necessarily the same specimens.
Okay.
Yeah. And then any other organisms buried with the specimen. Any other organisms buried with the specimen, and then some features of the sediment. Those I found less interesting because I'm not a sedimentologist, and so I didn't pay a lot of attention, to be honest, about some of the features of the sediment. Yeah.
So are other organisms, are you talking about like microscopic?
Yes, many of them. Yep. All right. Any questions on what they did? So this is like just rooting through everything. These are the key things of what they did. Right? You love it. You love it, or you're getting close to loving it because you're practicing the actions of love and you know that the emotion will follow. Right? No? You don't know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about, right?
I'm loving it.
Yeah. You'll really know what I'm talking about soon.
Okay.
How old's your daughter?
I don't know.
Son, you have Charles the Fourth. How old is he?
Third. Like 14 months.
Charles the Third, 14 months. Yeah, so you'll learn in like 6 months.
Okay.
Practicing the actions of love, knowing that the emotions will follow. All right. And so here is a lot of the characteristics of the diatoms that they found with almost every single specimen. Just a huge deposit of diatomaceous earth. Remnants of once living diatoms. So here's a zoom in on diatom shells. Here's an electron micrograph of some of the key characteristics of some of these diatoms and this diatomaceous earth. And so found a lot of diatoms, and just a lot of diatoms. And I'll mention this a little bit when we talk about key results, but they found all sorts of different kinds of diatoms. Freshwater diatoms, marine diatoms. The only thing they really didn't find is sedimentary diatoms, like those that live in the sediment in deep marine environments. Which is kind of interesting, right? Because it's buried, why aren't there, the diatoms that typically live near the surface? What else did they find? Incredibly well-preserved whale specimens. Incredibly well-preserved. Incredibly whale-preserved? Had to do it, right? That's a chuckle. I love it. I love it. So incredibly well-preserved that it's one of the few places on Earth that you can find fossilized baleen. And so baleen is structured like hair or fingernails, okay? Somewhere in between the two, okay? It's made out of the same protein, alpha keratin, okay? And it's somewhere in between the two in terms of its rigidness. Rigidity is probably a better term than rigidness, because I don't think rigidness is a word. But it's somewhere in between hair and fingernails. So it deteriorates incredibly rapidly. It's almost impossible to find fossil baleen, okay? Except for in something like this. So incredibly well preserved. I think 95+% of the skeletons were complete or close to complete, meaning only missing, 1 or 2 bones. And a lot of those that were missing bones, they explained it that was mostly modern erosion. Like the skeleton looks completely intact and then one vertebra is missing. So it's like, did something rip a vertebra out of this as it was, getting ready to be fossilized? Likely not. It probably weathered away and rolled down a hill somewhere.
Would this be considered a Lagerstätten?
Yes.
Okay.
That was the very last sentence of the summary is that this is a true Lagerstätten. Yeah, check it out. It's nice to know you read that last sentence, Charles.
I did read the summary very carefully, but not that carefully.
Did you see it? It's on
Yeah.
page 21.
Yeah.
What is it?
A large number of cetaceans and include soft tissue baleen makes the Pisco Formation assemblage a true fossil Lagerstätten.
What's the lowest one?
It's just a collection of incredibly well-preserved organisms. Yeah.
Bridgestell, Solnhofen,
Yeah.
Yixiang.
Where you get, hundreds. Yeah, some of them only have dozens, but hundreds of the same organisms incredibly well preserved. All right? So this is cool, right? You love this.
Yes.
You love it.
I love it.
And you're like, there are just diatoms everywhere. Diatoms, all sorts of different kinds, except benthic diatoms. And you have incredibly well preserved whale carcasses, whale specimens, and just hundreds of them. And so then we have now we have to interpret these data, right? We have these data, and it's not an empirical scientific inquiry, although you can do some empirical studies to test your predictions, but it's not truly empirical, meaning your interpretations are going to be heavily influenced by your philosophical commitments. And also meaning that you have to do a significant amount of interpretation, right? Because you can construct a really good controlled experiment where your interpretation of the data is very simple, right? Presence, absence, more or less, right? Becomes very simple. This is not one of those studies. Very complicated data interpretation. All right? So how do we explain this as a methodological naturalist? Somebody want to take a stab at that? Okay, so you find incredibly well-preserved whale fossils from at a number of, remember we recorded elevations, this is a number of different elevations. You're talking about a pretty significant amount of the fossil rock there. Okay, they're not all in the same exact stratigraphic zone. Incredibly well preserved, but would have had to have been a fairly long time. Yeah, listen.
Oh, I thought, did we talk about this? Like, that basically there's two main ideas. Either the environment was super different back then that caused them not to fall apart so quickly,
Okay.
or they were just buried really quickly in some catastrophic event.
Yeah, although
That's unusual for
yeah. Here's the problem with that second interpretation. So when you actually use radiometric dating to date the rock, the oldest rock that contains these whale fossils dates to about 7.5 to 8 million years old. The youngest rock in this formation dates to about 6.5 to 7 million years old. So there's about 1 million years worth of difference in these radiometric dating.
Is it like uniform and then little by little it gets older? Or is it like
Yes. Yes. It is basically uniform and little by little it gets older. So when you date the rocks at the very bottom of it, you're getting consistently 7.5 to 8 million years. When you date rocks at the top, you're getting very consistently 6.5 to 7 million years. If you date rocks in the middle, you're getting very consistently 7 million years. It's very predictable, very nice, right, as far as radiometric dating is concerned. And dating to the right age, right, of where these very end of the Miocene epoch and very beginning of Pliocene epoch, what they should date to. All right? So because of that, it can't be rapid burial, right? Because 1 million years of time is not rapid burial. It has to be very normal. Like these whales didn't die all at the same time. They died normally, and they just all happened to be really well preserved. There was just something about this burial ground, something about the sediment that they're ending up in that leads to them being incredibly well preserved. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Could there have been like a semi-regular, like catastrophic event, like a minor one that just built up?
Sure, yeah,
Rather
sure, and
than
that would
one
work.
big one that set the whole layer since there's
Yes.
so much time between the layers.
And so that would work. I'm gonna draw stick figures for whales, okay? And I can only draw human stick figures, but just know in your mind these are whales, okay? So let's say we've got this gap. You're like, that's not a stick figure. And this represents 1 million years, okay? And this is the gap. And then we've got whales here. We've got whales here. Whoa, what happened there? And then like we've got a space, and we've got whales. I just can't even draw human stick figures. This is bad. And then we've got a space, and we've got this. And then you're like, yeah, we could interpret that as a series of catastrophic events, but over a period of 1 million years. Okay? The problem is this isn't what you find. This is what you find. Through the whole column, you find whale fossils. It doesn't look like what you're getting is like some mass catastrophe, and then maybe 400,000 years later you get another mass catastrophe, and then 400,000 years later you get another mass catastrophe. It just looks like normal dying of whales, right? That over 1 million years you have, thousands of well-preserved specimens that died, under normal, regular circumstances and just happened to end up in a place where their bodies didn't decompose very quickly. It gave lots and lots of time for them to get covered by sediment and then well preserved. Yeah.
Sorry, who was the Ice Age?
Which one?
Was there an Ice Age near this time?
No. Mm-mm. The most recent ice age is right at Pleistocene Holocene boundary, and it's like, remember that one that's at 11,000 or 11.5 Ka? That's the last of the big ice ages, but there's not a significant ice age right here. Yeah. And so here are the interpretations. Maybe they end up in anoxic sediment. Anoxic meaning without oxygen. And so it really slows decay. So maybe an anoxic condition of that sediment just really slowed decay. And so you just have this burial ground that no matter when a whale shows up, it's just going to decay really slowly, and so they're always going to be really well preserved. Or maybe they got covered by just a mat of diatoms. Okay? And so you get what are called diatomaceous mats, just like a blanket of diatoms. And so it prevented scavenging and prevented colonization, right? This blanket of diatoms covers it, so scavengers don't find the carcasses. Animals that would typically colonize it, dig into the bone, like polychaete worms, which are a type of segmented worm, like earthworms, don't get in and start, really breaking down these. So they may not have actually decomposed really slowly, they just got covered up and they didn't get scavenged. And so since they didn't get scavenged, they could have decomposed at a regular rate, but then as they get buried, because what you find is some of the most rapid deterioration of skeletons happens as a result of scavenging and of colonization with other animals. Yeah.
Two things. There was some evidence of scavenging. There was very
yes,
small
very
amounts,
small.
so.
Right. You found one carcass with whale teeth actually lodged inside. Yeah, shark teeth lodged inside the vertebral column, looking like sharks were scavenging.
Yeah.
And there were some specimens that looked like they had been scavenged by crabs and some other animals, but it was very little.
So those are outliers, but I
Yes.
think they still need explanation. But second of
They
all,
do.
has there been any taphonomic research of anoxic conditions
Yes, and they actually cited it in their discussion.
in the discussion?
Yeah, they cited a number of studies that show that it actually anoxic conditions does nothing to change the rate of decomposition.
I remember that. Yes.
Yeah, it changes what organisms are doing the decomposition, but it doesn't actually change the rate of decomposition.
But
you just get a different community of decomposers.
Would it change what is broken down? For example, could it? I mean, nothing.
Do you mean the order?
No, like the baleen is preserved. Would baleen normally be preserved in an anoxic environment?
That's a good question. I don't know if anybody's just been lucky enough to find a dead baleen whale and decided to go and put it in a really anoxic sediment.
Because there's nothing else that was preserved in the area except for bones and baleen, which
Right.
which flesh decays anyways in anoxic conditions.
Yes.
So that honestly makes sense to me. It could be an anoxic condition if baleen can be preserved in that kind of condition.
Sure, but it doesn't. But what it doesn't do is give you any indication of why they would be so well preserved, right? It may be sure they are in anoxic conditions
Like
and they're
articulated?
decomposing there, right? But if the rate of the decay is still the same, well, it's more than just a matter of getting scavenged, disarticulating the skeleton. It's also the level of preservation and maintaining those soft tissues, right? So again, you're focusing on baleen, but those aren't the only soft tissues that you find. You still find ligaments. You still find tendons. You find all of these things that are mineralized, but are still present in
They
there.
said that in the paper?
Yes.
Oh, I missed that.
And so it talks about that the outer covering is gone, right? It looks like that was gone. The outer covering, the skin, the fascia, the underlying muscle, that was gone. But the connective tissues are still there and fully mineralized. Yeah. And then diatomaceous mats. You don't find a significant amount of evidence. Yes, there are a lot of diatoms, but they're not forming mats that are blanketing these whales. They're just making up the sediment that's there. All right. So how do we explain this from methodological naturalism? Well, the radiometric dating really prevents us from interpreting rapid burial. Right? We have to interpret something else. Slowed decomposition. What about under interventionism? We still have to deal with some of these issues, right? You still have to deal with issues of like, how does the outer covering decompose, but the baleen doesn't, right? And the connective tissues holding bone together doesn't.
I think with interventionism, I mean, it helps like eliminate the not the carbon, but the dating methods. Kind of like that's not as relevant, but we still have a lot of the same issues.
You still have to mention it, right? And this is what we'll talk about not until Monday. Because entirely on Monday, we're going to spend, okay, what happens if you consider both the Bible and science to be significant sources of knowledge? What happens when they disagree, right? How do you deal with that? What are the different options? How do you work through that? But if you're going to hold to both are very important and help us to understand better the natural world, you basically have to say something like this. You can't just say, like, the radiometric dating is false because the Bible disagrees with it, right? You can say that, but it's not particularly helpful. So you'd say something like this. The Bible seems to be incongruent with millions of years of time, implying that we need to better understand radiometric dating, right? You can't, you can, but you shouldn't just say those radiometric dates are wrong because the Bible proves them wrong, right? You'd say something that they are inconsistent, so we need to better understand these radiometric dating techniques. Yeah.
Aren't they like pretty accurate for like archaeological?
Sometimes.
I know that they can compare like the date of like a coin and like the date of the radiometric.
Yes. So carbon-14 is really good between 1/2 of a half-life and 2.5 half-lives. So the half-life of carbon-14 is about 5,200 years. 5,730 years. Okay. So between about 2,800 years and up to like 15,000, it seems to be pretty good. Which is one of the main reasons why but many people assume that there are some gaps in the genealogies in Genesis, and the Earth isn't 6,000 to 10,000 years old. It's more like maybe 15,000 to 20,000 years old because of the success of carbon-14 in archaeological sites. But when you get beyond 2.5 half-lives of anything, your accuracy significantly deteriorates, and it deteriorates quickly. And so if you're going to use carbon-14 to try to date something that's 100,000 years old, you have to understand your accuracy is significantly... Is that a dog? Is significantly damaged as a result of that. Did it sound like a dog barking?
No, it sounds like they're opening a box.
Oh.
So you would say that this could be, the bottom rock is lower or older
Yes.
than the top, but it's
Yep.
just not like a million.
But it's not a
years.
million years different. Yep. That you're certainly dealing with the bottom rock is older than the top rock, but it's not a million
Because
years.
this cannot be one single event that killed all these whales. 'Cause
No,
there
it's
are
not.
thousands
Yeah.
of whales.
And even so, you wouldn't interpret it as a single event from any model because it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
I mean, how would you even? There's not enough physical space to bury the number of whales that are here at the same time. There's just, unless you just were able to generate huge amounts of sediment all at the same time, which would take not just a local cataclysmic event, but more of a global scale catastrophe.
So do people who believe in the flood believe that the flood did this?
Not this.
Oh.
No, these are post-flood deposits for most flood models. So the state of the whales and the diatoms implies rapid burial. That it implies rapid burial, not right away, right, but within probably a couple of weeks to a month. So the outermost tissues decompose or deteriorate or maybe are ripped off as the animal is rolled around, which is another option. I don't know if anyways, I was going to say I don't know if you've rolled a dead body around, but then that was kind of weird and creepy. But I said it anyways, but the number of specimen implies that we're not looking at a single mass die-off, but really we're looking at several mass die-offs that are all post-flood, that are after the end of the flood, that something is going on in this environment, that you're having regular, repeated mass die-off events in these baleen winds. Okay? Yeah.
What would cause that?
Yeah, so they gave some potential explanations. They suggested that the absence of benthic diatoms suggests that this was not a deep marine environment, that this was in a shallow marine environment close to the shore, and that the sediments, including having a lot of diatoms, have a lot of volcanic material. Volcanic ash, volcanic glass in these sediments. and then so they suggested that there was probably a relationship between regular volcanic eruptions and these mass die-off events. Which makes sense, because people that are close to volcanic eruptions oftentimes, die as a result of ash or some other issue and not getting buried by magma. Alright? Yeah, so they give some potential explanations for it, but their interpretations of the data are significantly different than what you would come up with under a methodological naturalism, where you are committed to the ages of those radiometric dates. Yeah.
So their suggestions would be that there is a volcano that kept on erupting?
Yes. Which that's what volcanoes tend to do, right? Unless they go dormant, but they tend to erupt on a fairly regular pattern until, an equilibrium is established and they stop. Yeah. All right. Any questions? Concerns? All right. Well, we are 5 minutes before our scheduled end time, but I have nothing left for you. So if you want to stick around for the 5 minutes and get the full amount of what you paid for, I will not leave. But if you want to leave, I will not blame you.
So we just never answered the question, though. We just talked about more questions.
And what question is that?